Welcome back to the Web Animation Programming Guide. In this video, we'll cover keyframes programming. Keyframes enable you to create animations that can have one or more value changes plotted in them. Between each keyframe, a transition or transitional frames will run, and we just learned about transitions in the previous section. Keyframes are capable of repeating or looping infinitely, or you can set them to repeat or loop just a certain amount of times. They can also be paused, reversed, alternated, among other cool features. Here is a quick overview of the nuts and bolts that you will learn to use in this section of the guide. And keep in mind that some of the JavaScript interfacing for keyframes programming is still experimental, so be sure to test in all of the popular browsers so that you know when you can use these things confidently in your projects. Let's take another quick look at the CSS properties that can be animated. And I'm going to be focusing mainly on the transform property in this section. But just remember that you can animate any of these properties. I'm going to start with a very simple example.html file. We're going to type in an @keyframes rule. Then we put space and the name that we want the animation to have. I'll just name mine animation 1. And then I'll put opening curly brace and closing curly brace. Now inside of animation 1 is where I list all of my keyframes that I want the animation to have. You can use the from opening curly brace, closing curly brace, and to opening curly brace, closing curly brace. From and to keywords, which are equivalent to 0% and 100%. So since they're equivalent, I'm just going to use 0% and 100%. Now in the first keyframe, the starting keyframe for my animation, I'm going to set the transform property and use the translate X function. Then for the ending keyframe or the final keyframe, I'm going to put this on 300 pixels. Let's go ahead and put in the two animation properties that we need just to see this thing running. So let's press refresh. And we see that we have an animation. So these two properties, animation name and animation duration, that's the minimum amount of properties that you have to declare in order to get an animation to run. But there's still 6 more animation properties that will help you set things the way you like it. You can see that I'm referring to animation 1 in the animation name property. In the animation duration property, we can put 2 seconds or 2000 milliseconds or any amount of time that you want there. Put on 1.5. So if I was to put the other 6 animation properties in place, they all have their default values that I'm starting with. So you'll see that the animation runs exactly the same as it did before. So what happens when I didn't have these 6 properties in place, their defaults were just being used. So instead of ease, I can have a linear animation. You can see that it behaves differently now. Iteration count I can put on 2, and you'll see that the animation runs twice now instead of just once. I can also put that on 3, 4, 5, 100, or infinite. I can use the infinite keyword and it will just keep running. That'll make it loop infinitely. The timing functions for animations we already discussed in the last video, so I'm not going to go over all of that again. The animation duration is just the amount of seconds or milliseconds that you want the animation to have overall. The animation iteration count is you just put a number value there, or you can use the infinite keyword. For the animation direction, you can have either normal, reverse, alternate, or alternate reverse. So if I was to reverse this animation, it goes the other way. If I alternate it, it's going to go back and forth. So you can have a 2 keyframe animation that goes back and forth. You wouldn't have to have 3 keyframes in there to make something go back and forth between 2 different value states. And you can also alternate reverse. which just plays it in reverse. It still goes back and forth. So I'll just leave that on normal. Now the animation play state can be either running, which is the default value, or paused. If I put it on paused, it just won't run. So in JavaScript, you can call the play state and put the paused value there, and it will pause the animation. And then you can resume it by putting the running value back. The animation delay is simply the amount of seconds or milliseconds that you want the animation to be delayed. For the animation fill mode, you can have either none, forwards, backwards, or both. And to demonstrate that, let me put this on iteration count of 1 and refresh. So it plays the animation just once. You see how the object goes back to its initial value after the animation is complete? If I wanted to stay at the ending value for the ending keyframe, which is the 100% keyframe, I'll put the fill mode on forwards. See, now the object stays. So forwards will apply property values in the last keyframe to the object, and then backwards applies the property values from the first keyframe, and both would follow instructions for both forward and back. Okay, so now we know what all the properties and values mean in the CSS. We can go ahead and show you the shorthand version now. We'll just use the shorthand animation property, and we can put the animation name first, and then after a space we'll put the animation duration, then the animation timing function, put a space, then put that in place there. Then we'll put the animation iteration count after the timing function. Then after the iteration count, we're going to put the direction, which was normal. So then we had running, 0 seconds, and forwards. I'm going to put the timing function back on ease. And if I remove any of these, it'll just default. It'll use the default values for any of the settings that I leave out. For any of the animation properties that I leave out of the shorthand, their defaults will be used. So if I remove forwards, the none default value will be used, and it won't stay in its position at the end of the animation. It goes back to its initial state. So you don't have to have all of these values in place, just the ones that you want to specify a different value from the default values. Now this whole time we've been working with a keyframes animation that has only 2 keyframes in it. So what if we want to have 3 keyframe animation? Then we just put one in between the initial and ending keyframes, and that would be 50%, would be directly in between those. Let's put this translate X on 100 and this one on 200. It'll go 100 pixels, then another 100 pixels. And if you want the first and second keyframes to take up most of the animation, you could put this on something like 90, and from 0 to 90 will take up most of the animation, and then 90 to 100 will be the remainder of it. See, so it goes very slow for the first 100 pixels, and then for the last 100 pixels it goes very quickly. So 90% of the animation is going from 0 pixels to 100 pixels, and then only 10% of the time, the duration time of the animation, is it going from 100 to 200. So you can determine which keyframes get the most duration time of the animation by setting these numbers appropriately. So let me put this back on 50. Okay, I'm going to change this up to add a little bit of translate Y. Actually, we'll make it go across the screen first, then we'll make it go down. Make it go across 300, down 300. So in the first keyframe, it'll be at 0. The second keyframe, it'll go translate X 200 pixels. And in the third keyframe, I want to translate X and translate Y. So now what if we want a 4 keyframe animation? Then we can copy this one and we'll put this one at 33%, this one something around 66%, and that will divide it into 4. So for the last one, the translate X will put back on 0. That'll make the ball or the object go back to the left. Let's see what we have. Yep, and we can slow the animation down a little bit. And if we want a 5 keyframe animation, we can do a similar thing. So let's go ahead and copy the 100 again, and let's change our values once again to this would be 25, this would be 50, this would be 75. So that'll give us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 keyframes now that are all evenly split. So the duration time is split evenly through all of the keyframes. And remember, you can adjust these values if you want certain keyframes to take more of the duration time than others. So finally, we'll make it go back up to its 0, Y, 0X position. So let's see if that works. There we go. Now we can make it run more than one time. Let's put infinite, and it will just keep running. So that shows you how you can set up as many keyframes as you need. You can divide up that 100% as much as you need to. Okay, I don't need this because it's a default. I don't need that because that's default. That's a default. And I don't need the fill mode anymore either. Actually, ease is a default as well. So if I remove that, the animation would still run the same. But I'll just keep that in place. Now if I want to apply a completely different animation to that animation that's completely independent, I'll just name this one animation 2, and let's just go from 0 to 100. And here I'll animate the border radius. Let's go from 100% to 0%. And then I can just copy these settings and put a comma here, and now I can put animation 2. The duration will be 0.5, half a second, and we'll keep that going infinite as well, just so it keeps looping. Let's see what happens. Oh yeah, we have to let's make that alternate. Infinite and then alternate. That way it goes back and forth. There we go. So you can see that animation is running independent of the first animation. So animation 1 and animation 2 can have different duration times, timing functions. We can also animate multiple properties within each keyframe. So in our animation 2, we're going to affect the border radius and the background color. And you can affect as many properties as you like. Actually, it should be, make it red down here, and then sky blue here. Now it kind of looks like a police, the police lights. Now I'm going to quickly walk you through using the JavaScript animation events and DOM interfaces for CSS keyframes. And the CSS keyframes rule and CSS keyframe rule are both instances of CSS rule objects. Alright, I'm going to get rid of keyframe animation 2 and the reference to it here. Instead of infinite, I'm going to change this to 3. And I'm going to change this to 2 seconds even. The animation will run 3 times. And now let's pop in a script element. Then we can access object 1, add event listener. The type will be animation end and comma. And the listener will be a function. Open curly brace, close curly brace. And then close the parentheses for the add event listener. Bring that down a couple of lines. I'm pretty sure that any browser software that supports these types of animations and the animation end event will automatically create an object reference for any elements you have with an ID in your document. An object with that same corresponding name. But you can put var object1 is equal to document.getElementById object1, like that. Okay, so here we can access all of these event attributes within that event handler. So let's try this one, the elapsed time. So let's just issue an alert. Say event.elapsed time. So let's run that in the browser. That's one iteration, two, and the third one is here. The result from the alert is a 6. That's because it took 6 seconds for this animation to end, because we have it set at 3 iterations at 2 seconds each. If I put this on a 4, it would be 8 seconds. We can get the animation name. Animation 1, which is the name of the keyframes animation. So you can get all of that data, all of these event attributes. Now we'll check out the animation iteration event. Okay, so change this from animation end to animation iteration. So now we have an event listener for animation iteration event. And let's just go ahead and put the elapsed time as an alert every iteration. It says 2, 4, and 6. So every iteration we got an alert telling us how much time has elapsed. And ultimately you can do anything you want within these event handlers using your knowledge of JavaScript. Okay, let's put the animation back to running 3 times only. And let's remove this add event listener. And I'm going to pop in an alert. Well, what I'm going to do is target the document, then its style sheets object, the first style sheet, which is this style element, and then the CSS rules property, or the CSS rules object, to get access to these CSS rules using JavaScript. So I'm going to alert document.stylesheets, the first one in the list, CSS rules. Let's see what that gives us. That's an object of CSS rule list. Okay. Now in that rule list, I'm going to target the first element, and that should be this style rule for object 1. Yeah, we have an object CSS style rule. Now let's get the next one by putting a 1 here, which should target this keyframes animation. So let's see what we get now. Now we have an object of CSS keyframes rule, and that's what we're after. We're after targeting this style rule using JavaScript, and this line of code does it. So I'm going to use that line of code to make a variable named animation, and that's going to be equal to that line of code that targets this CSS keyframes rule. Now let's go ahead and check and see what kind of object that was again. CSS keyframes rule. So we can access all of this interface CSS keyframes rule. The name attribute, CSS rules attribute, append rule method, delete rule method, and the find rule method. So here I'm just going to put that in a comment. Whoops. There we go. So these are the things that we can access. These 2 attributes and then these 3 methods. So if I was to alert animation.name, I get animation 1. If I alert the CSS rules, I get a CSS rule list. Now I'll show you how to use the find rule method. So I say animation.find rule at 50%. So the rule at 50% has transform, translate x 200, and translate y 200. Now without tapping into its properties yet, let's see what kind of object that gives us. Object CSS keyframe rule. So the singular keyframe, which was this interface. That means we can access these properties or attributes. .css text. Let's see what that gives us. You can see we get the whole keyframe for 50%. We can also get the key text only. That shows 50%. Now I'll show you how to use append rule and delete rule. So let's use delete rule first. So we can remove this CSS text and change find rule to delete rule. And we're going to remove it from the alert, Control X, because we're going to actually execute that code in a button. So I'll put a button element, and in its on click event, I'm going to run that code that I just cut out of the alert. And then I'm going to type in the button text or the button label to say delete 50% or delete keyframe at 50%. And I'm just going to make the animation run infinite so we can see it keep running. Okay, so you see how the animation just runs in a square formation? Now watch, I'm going to delete keyframe at 50%. See how it changes the animation? That was when it was going here, was at the 50% keyframe. And now that keyframe is gone from the animation. And using append rule is very similar, but instead of just feeding it the 50% in the string, you feed the entire rule. So in the string, you're going to have an entire rule that you want to append to that keyframes animation. So I'll append the 50% rule to 250 when that button is clicked. So we'll change this to say append keyframe at 50% with these new values, which can also be made dynamic. So I'm going to append, and this right here at this point is where the 50% mark is, so that value should change now when I click this. Okay, now it's down here. It's at 250x, 250y. And let's say I wanted so let's say instead of manipulating or messing with the 50% rule, let's just add a 60% rule to this keyframes animation. So it will insert a 60% rule in instead of changing or altering the 50% rule. Let's check that out. Now we'll add it, and then you see how it has a little zigzag there because we added the 60% rule. That goes to 250x, 250y. And this should have said add keyframe at 60. And this is what that code looks like in JavaScript in the normal script and not inside of the on-click event listener. You can see everything in the append rule is within a string, so it's either single quotes or double quotes. We'll have to encapsulate it. Okay, so let's get rid of that. Let's get rid of that. Let's get rid of all that. And finally, the last thing we'll show you is how, let's just type in object1.style, how we can apply animation property to objects or elements using JavaScript. So we can go ahead and take this code here and then just remove that property altogether. And now we'll apply that animation property to object 1 using JavaScript, just like that. Let's see if we have an animation. Yep. And if you have to use the longhand properties like animation name, you use camel casing and no hyphen. So you wouldn't go like that. Camel case the second word. So there's animation name, animation duration. So that's only if you have to use the longhand properties. but you can just use all of the shorthand properties like this. Now we'll quickly show you how to call these animations to run on objects dynamically whenever you need to. So I'll comment out that code that applies the animation to object 1, and I'll type a button, and I'm going to put in a keyframes animation 2. That's going to change an object's background color from sky blue to red. And then I'll add a button element, and in the onClick event, actually put that in between single quotes because I'm going to take this code right here and put that in the onClick event, or in the click event for this button. Then I'm going to take that button, copy it, make a similar one that says animation 2, and then that's going to run animation 2 on object 1, and this one we'll set to alternate, so it'll play those colors. It'll transition those colors back and forth. Oh, actually we have to remove this. So now we just have a stationary object, and we can apply animation 2 or animation 1 first. Actually, let's change the timing on that to 0.5 seconds. Now apply animation 2, and then animation 1, animation 2, animation 1. And if you wanted those to work together, you can just run both animations. Get rid of that, and put that code. Put a comma here, and then you'll have the shorthand for the second one, and then you can just put the word animate, and it will call both of those animations to run on that object. So that just shows you how you can dynamically apply any of these keyframe animations here to your objects dynamically and interactively. You can also append keyframes, delete keyframes, or find the keyframes you need, all dynamically through script. The last little bit of programming I want to show you is if you ever need to create one of these keyframes animations complete on the fly using JavaScript. Maybe you have a need where you need to create it dynamically with dynamic values. This little script takes care of that. So you can see we have a head element that closes here. So basically what this code does is it sets up a variable for the keyframes animation syntax right there. You can see the @keyframes rule is complete right there. You put that all in one line. Then we're creating a style element using the create element method. We affect the inner HTML of that style element and put the keyframes text into the inner HTML property for that style element. Then finally we append the style element to the head element of the document, which basically gives you a keyframes animation, something like that. And all of these values in here can be dynamic. Even the name of the animation can be dynamic. Its name can be dynamic. Its keyframes, key text can be dynamic, and the keyframe settings all can be dynamic. And then after that's inserted into the head of the document, you can see we're targeting object 1, and we're putting the style, that animation, and the animation properties that we want in place. So this is if you ever need to create your keyframes animation syntax on the fly dynamically or interactively. In the next episode, we're going to tackle sprite animations using sprite sheets, and that involves keyframes. Each of these episodes are going to blend into the next, so the information and the training that you get from the previous one will benefit you in the next ones.